Li Wei stepped off the bus, the bright sunlight falling on his face as he squinted at the historic site in front of him. It was a place he had always wanted to see, a famous landmark known around the world for its history and beauty. He had spent weeks planning this trip, scrolling through travel blogs, watching videos online, and memorizing little phrases he thought would help him blend in. Today he felt confident. Today he felt ready. As he walked toward the entrance, Li Wei noticed the guards standing in neat lines, their uniforms crisp and their faces serious. There were signs everywhere, warning visitors about restricted areas, reminding them to respect the rules and telling them not to touch anything. But Li Wei, full of excitement and a touch of arrogance, barely glanced at the warnings. Rules are for others, not me, he thought, smiling to himself. He imagined himself as clever and worldly, someone who could move through places unnoticed, like he had seen in movies. He reached the first checkpoint, where a guard raised his hand, signaling that visitors should stop and check in. Li Wei waved casually, pretending not to see the gesture. The guard spoke firmly, pointing to a sign and saying something in the local language. Li Wei only nodded vaguely and kept moving, thinking that the guard probably would not stop him. After all, he looked like a tourist, and tourists were always welcome, right? Around him, other visitors were following the rules, stopping at checkpoints, reading signs, and showing their tickets. Li Wei, however, felt a thrill in ignoring them. He told himself he was saving time, moving faster, and that the guard was probably just doing his job for formality. He didn't realize that the guard was not just a figure of authority, but someone trained to notice even small missteps, especially by visitors who seemed unsure or reckless. Li Wei walked further in, past beautifully paved paths, ancient stone walls, and carefully preserved gardens. The air was warm, and he felt the excitement building inside him. He paused to take out his camera, snapping pictures of the surroundings. He noticed a few other tourists looking at him with curiosity, perhaps wondering why he had not stopped at the checkpoint. Li Wei did not care. He was focused on his own adventure, imagining the photos he would post online, the friends who would envy him, and the stories he would tell when he returned home. He strolled closer to a restricted area, where a large gate and a serious-looking guard stood. The guard's eyes followed every person approaching, and his hand rested on his belt in a professional way. Li Wei could see him, clear as day, but he chose to ignore him. "I can handle this," he whispered to himself. "It is just a rule, not the end of the world." He tried to walk faster, hoping that by the time the guard noticed, he would already be past. The guard, however, was trained to notice such behavior. He stepped forward, raising his voice in the local language, trying to stop Li Wei. Li Wei only waved his hand, smiling nervously but still moving forward. Other tourists glanced at him, some shaking their heads, others whispering to their companions. Li Wei did not hear them. He was too focused on his plan to move quickly, ignore the authority, and keep going as if nothing mattered. In his mind, he even imagined a small escape plan. If the guard asked for his papers, he thought, he could smile and explain in broken English, or maybe pretend he was from another country. He had watched videos of travelers handling such situations, and he felt ready to improvise. Confidence surged through him. He felt clever, resourceful, and above all, untouchable. As he reached the edge of the restricted area, the guard raised both hands, signaling him to stop again. This time, Li Wei hesitated for a fraction of a second. His heart beat a little faster. Around him, the other visitors obeyed without question, showing tickets and respecting boundaries. Li Wei's hesitation, however, did not last long. He shook his head, brushing aside the thought of possible trouble. He told himself that the guard would probably just wave him through eventually. He had done nothing wrong after all. He stepped closer, ignoring the repeated gestures, the raised voice, and the sharp look from the guard. Li Wei imagined himself as bold, adventurous, and daring, someone who could move freely in foreign lands without being constrained by small rules. He did not consider that his boldness was seen by others as carelessness, that his daring was being watched, and that his adventure could soon turn into an embarrassment. Li Wei paused briefly to admire an old stone structure near the gate. It was beautifully carved, intricate, and perfectly preserved. He took out his camera again, pretending to take a photograph. But in reality, he was buying himself a few seconds to decide what to do next. He thought about turning back, but his pride would not allow it. He had made a decision and he was determined to follow it. As he moved closer, the guard stepped right in front of him, blocking his path. Li Wei froze, unsure whether to stop or push forward. The guard spoke firmly again, this time pointing directly at Li Wei, signaling that he must present identification or leave the area. Li Wei's mind raced. He did not have the right papers in his pocket, and he did not know the local language well enough to explain himself. Panic started to creep in. Li Wei tried to smile, hoping that charm could work where rules and authority failed. He nodded politely, gesturing as if he understood the guard. The guard remained serious, showing no sign of backing down. Around them, other tourists were now looking more directly, some with curiosity, some with amusement. Li Wei felt a flush of embarrassment, but he still did not want to admit defeat. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Maybe I can just pretend I'm from somewhere else. That should work." In a sudden impulse, he blurted out that he was Japanese, hoping that claiming another nationality would confuse the guard enough to let him through. His words were broken, uneven, and desperate. He pointed at himself, hoping the guard would understand, hoping the lie would work. The guard looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. He gestured for Li Wei to produce identification. Li Wei's confidence faltered completely. He fumbled through his bag and wallet, realizing that he had nothing to support his claim. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to find a solution, but the truth was unavoidable. He had made a mistake, ignored the rules, and now he would face the consequences. Other tourists now whispered quietly, noticing the awkward scene. Some exchanged glances, silently judging, while others watched curiously, waiting to see what would happen next. Li Wei felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His boldness and arrogance had led him to this moment of vulnerability. He realized for the first time in the day that he was not clever, resourceful, or untouchable. Li Wei's thoughts raced as he tried to figure out what to do. He imagined apologizing, explaining, pleading, or even running, but none of these options seemed safe or likely to work. He had ignored warnings, disregarded instructions, and now he was caught. The reality of the situation hit him hard, and he could not escape it with words or charm. As the guard continued to watch him, calm but unyielding, Li Wei felt a sense of regret. He thought about the signs he had ignored, the rules he had brushed aside, and the other tourists who had followed instructions without question. He realized that respect and awareness mattered more than cleverness or daring. The lesson was harsh but clear, and he understood that this moment would stay with him long after he left the site. Li Wei stood there, caught between pride and humility, excitement and fear. The adventure he had imagined was nowhere in sight. Instead, he faced an uncomfortable truth. In a foreign land, ignoring authority and pretending to be someone else could never replace honesty, respect, and attentiveness. He took another deep breath, preparing himself for whatever would come next, silently promising that he would learn from this mistake, even if it meant feeling embarrassed in front of the world. Li Wei felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the guard stood in front of him, unmoving with a look that made it clear he would not be fooled. His earlier confidence now felt like a distant memory, replaced with a rising sense of panic. Around him, the crowd of tourists continued moving along, many taking pictures or chatting, some glancing curiously at his awkward situation. Li Wei realized, perhaps for the first time, that ignoring rules was not a game, and pretending to be someone else could not save him. He fumbled in his bag, pulling out his wallet and passport, hoping that somehow, something would make the guard believe him. He opened it quickly, flipping through the pages, and then froze. He had no identification that could support his sudden claim of being Japanese. The passport in his hand was unmistakably Chinese, and the guard's eyes narrowed as he noticed it. Li Wei swallowed hard, realizing that he had trapped himself with his own words. Trying to recover, Li Wei waved his hands and smiled nervously. He spoke a few broken phrases, attempting to mix English and Japanese words he had learned from travel videos. I Japanese, yes. Tourist, he stammered. But the guard did not seem convinced at all. Instead, he shook his head slightly and pointed to a small desk a few meters away, signaling that Li Wei should follow. There was no anger in the guard's expression, only calm authority, and that made Li Wei feel even smaller. Li Wei took a deep breath and followed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His heart raced as he walked past the gate, the feeling of embarrassment growing with every step. He could hear murmurs from other tourists, Some whispered to their companions, "Did you see that?" He tried to lie about being Japanese. Others simply watched quietly, sensing that something unusual was happening. Li Wei wished he could disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. At the small desk, a second guard asked him to present his passport again. Li Wei handed it over shakily, trying to explain once more that he was somehow Japanese. The guard examined the passport carefully, flipping through the pages, comparing the photo to Li Wei's face. It was obvious to everyone watching that Li Wei was not Japanese. His heart sank further. He realized that his attempt to bluff his way out had completely failed. The guard then asked him to step aside and wait. Li Wei stood there feeling a mix of fear, shame, and frustration. He looked around and saw the other tourists quietly following the rules. They had respected authority, shown their identification, and moved along without incident. Li Wei's mind raced with regret. He wished he had stopped when the guard first raised his hand, when the signs clearly instructed visitors to follow certain rules. Now it seemed he had to face the consequences fully. As he waited, a few local authorities approached. They spoke to the guard, then turned their attention to Li Wei. The language barrier made communication difficult, and Li Wei's attempts to explain himself in broken phrases only added to the confusion. He gestured, nodded, and repeated his story about being Japanese, but the authorities were polite yet firm. They clearly did not believe him. The lie he had thought clever now felt heavy and useless. Li Wei's mind wandered back to earlier moments in the day. He remembered walking past the first checkpoint, ignoring the warning signs, thinking he was too smart to be stopped. He thought about the thrill he felt when he waved off the guard, believing he could charm his way through. All those small choices, each seeming harmless in the moment, had now built up to this uncomfortable situation. He realized that arrogance had led him into a trap he could not escape. The authorities asked him to sit while they checked his information. Li Wei complied, feeling every eye on him. He could sense a mix of curiosity and judgment from the tourists around him. Some tried to hide their smiles, while others whispered to companions, clearly enjoying the unfolding drama. Li Wei felt small, realizing that he had become the center of attention in a way he had never intended. Time seemed to stretch as he waited. He thought about what he could have done differently. Respecting the signs, listening to the guard, and being honest would have kept him out of this situation. Now there was no quick fix. No charm or clever words that could undo the consequences of his earlier decisions. The lesson was becoming painfully clear. In a foreign country, the rules mattered more than he had ever imagined, and pretending to be someone else was never a solution. Eventually, one of the authorities returned with a translator. They asked Li Wei a series of questions about his nationality, his purpose at the site, and why he had ignored the rules. Li Wei answered as best as he could, explaining that he had meant no harm and that he was genuinely interested in seeing the historical site. His voice shook slightly, betraying his nervousness and embarrassment. He could see the guards listening carefully, not angry but clearly expecting full honesty. Li Wei realized that his attempts to cover up the situation with lies had only made things worse. Each excuse, each fumbled phrase had added weight to the misunderstanding. The pretended identity he had chosen, the quick story that he thought would save him, was collapsing under the reality of the situation. He wished he could rewind the morning, go back to the moment he ignored the first warning, and choose a different path. As the translator continued, Li Wei began to feel a mixture of relief and fear. Relief because the authorities were listening, taking his words seriously and not treating him harshly. Fear because he knew that the outcome depended on his honesty now, and there was no way to guarantee a smooth resolution. He realized that the situation had become a test of patience, humility, and respect. Meanwhile, the other tourists continued moving through the site. Some glanced at Li Wei occasionally, curiosity in their eyes. Li Wei felt a strange mix of embarrassment and self-awareness. He had imagined himself as adventurous, clever, and untouchable. Now he felt foolish, realizing that he had been neither adventurous nor clever in ignoring rules. The lesson was clear. Humility and respect were far more valuable than pride or bravado. The authorities asked Li Wei to write down some information, and he complied, careful to be precise. He realized that following instructions, even if it was uncomfortable or humiliating, was better than attempting deception. His heart still pounded, but he felt a sense of clarity he had not experienced before. He understood that respect for rules, cultural awareness, and honesty were essential for anyone traveling abroad. After completing the paperwork, Li Wei was instructed to wait a little longer. He sat quietly, reflecting on the series of choices that had led him here. From the moment he ignored the first checkpoint to the moment he blurted out that he was Japanese, each decision had compounded the consequences. The story unfolding before him was a reminder that small missteps could snowball into serious situations, especially in unfamiliar environments. Li Wei's thoughts wandered to his family and friends back home. He imagined telling them about the experience, about how he had tried to bluff his way through, and how it had completely backfired. He realized that this story would be memorable, not for the excitement of travel but for the embarrassment of a mistake. Still, he resolved that the lesson was valuable. Next time he would respect local rules, listen to authorities, and never try to pretend to be someone else to avoid accountability. Finally, after what felt like hours, the translator returned with instructions. Li Wei would be allowed to continue his visit, but only after a careful explanation, apology, and acknowledgement that he had ignored rules. The relief was immense. He realized that while the consequences had been uncomfortable, they were also fair. The authorities had handled the situation professionally, and he had learned a vital lesson without any severe punishment. Li Wei stood up, feeling the weight of the experience on his shoulders. As he walked past the guard, he nodded respectfully, showing a genuine understanding of what had happened. The guard returned a neutral but approving look, acknowledging that Li Wei had learned his lesson. Around him, tourists continued their visit, but Li Wei now felt more aware, cautious, and humble. The adventure he had imagined earlier had transformed into an unforgettable lesson about respect, honesty, and cultural awareness. As he moved further into the site, Li Wei reflected on the morning. He understood that travel was not just about seeing famous places, taking photos, or collecting memories. It was also about learning, adapting, and respecting the world around him. The incident at the checkpoint would remain with him, a reminder that arrogance and pretense could lead to trouble, but humility and honesty could turn a mistake into a valuable experience. By the time he reached the central area of the historic site, Li Wei's fear had transformed into cautious excitement. He still wanted to enjoy the beauty and history of the place, but now he did so with greater awareness. Each step, each glance at the signs, and each interaction with the staff reminded him that respect and attentiveness were part of the adventure. The experience had been humbling, but it had also made him a wiser traveler, one who would never again underestimate the importance of rules or the consequences of ignoring them. Li Wei paused at a small fountain, watching water ripple in the sunlight. He took a deep breath and smiled quietly to himself. He had learned a hard lesson, but he had learned it without serious harm. The incident with the guard, the failed attempt to pretend to be Japanese, and Li Wei walked through the historical site slowly, each step filled with a mixture of awe and lingering embarrassment. The morning incident with the guard still weighed on his mind. Even though he had been allowed to continue, the memory of his failed attempt to pretend to be Japanese kept replaying like a cautionary film in his head. He felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. Relief because he had not been harshly punished, anxiety because the lesson he had learned was unforgettable and humbling. As he moved deeper into the site, he tried to focus on the beauty around him. Ancient stone walls, delicate carvings, and carefully maintained gardens stretched as far as he could see. Tourists from different countries strolled past, snapping photos and chatting with their companions. Li Wei felt small among them, not because of their size, but because of their awareness and respect for the rules. He realized that his earlier carelessness had made him stand out in the worst way possible. He paused at a small bridge overlooking a quiet pond. The water reflected the sunlight shimmering gently, and Li Wei took a moment to breathe and calm his racing heart. He thought about what he could have done differently. If he had simply stopped when the guard first raised his hand, read the signs carefully, and followed instructions, none of the awkwardness would have happened. Instead, his attempt to bluff his way through had created a scene he could never forget. Li Wei noticed a group of tourists nearby, laughing quietly as they observed a young boy carefully following the rules. They seemed to appreciate the way the boy interacted respectfully with the guards. Li Wei could not help but compare himself to the child. He had been reckless and careless, thinking that rules did not apply to him. The comparison stung, but it also taught him a subtle lesson. Respect was not just for avoiding punishment. It was for understanding and participating in the culture he was visiting. A guide approached the group, speaking animatedly about the history of the site. Li Wei listened intently, trying to immerse himself in the stories and details. He realized that he had been so focused on getting past the guards and taking photos that he had almost missed the rich history surrounding him. The intricate carvings, the stories behind the walls, and the careful preservation of each building now seemed more valuable than the small victories he had imagined earlier in the day. As he continued walking, he reached a section of the site that was roped off. A sign clearly stated that visitors were not allowed beyond this point. The rope was thin, but it symbolized a boundary. Li Wei froze for a moment, remembering his earlier arrogance. For a brief second, he considered ignoring it, as he had done with the first checkpoint, but then he shook his head. He had learned his lesson. Ignoring the rules had brought him embarrassment and fear, and he did not want to repeat that mistake. He stepped back and looked at the rope, then at the guards nearby. Their calm, professional demeanor reminded him of the authority that could not be fooled. Li Wei realized that true confidence in travel did not come from avoiding rules or pretending to be someone else. It came from understanding, respect, and awareness. He took out his notebook and began jotting down thoughts, a personal reminder of the lessons he had learned. While writing, a local family approached the same area. The parents gently reminded their young daughter to stay behind the rope, explaining why the rule existed. Li Wei watched the interaction, noticing the patience and clarity in their explanation. He felt a pang of admiration. Here were people teaching respect without anger, using guidance instead of force. It was a different approach from the authority he had faced earlier, yet it was equally effective. Li Wei realized that respect could be both firm and kind, and that humility could come naturally if one paid attention. As he moved along, Li Wei spotted a small souvenir shop near the exit of the site. He decided to enter, thinking it might be a good way to distract himself and perhaps recover from the embarrassment. The shop was filled with trinkets, books, and postcards depicting the site. Li Wei carefully examined each item, noticing the attention to detail. For the first time in the day, he felt a sense of calm. He could enjoy the moment without worrying about authority, deception, or embarrassment. He picked up a small book about the site's history and began flipping through the pages. The illustrations were beautiful, showing old photographs, maps, and detailed drawings of the architecture. Li Wei felt a renewed appreciation for the place. It was not just a tourist destination. It was a living record of culture, history, and human effort. His earlier mistakes seemed small compared to the richness surrounding him. While browsing, the shopkeeper noticed Li Wei and greeted him warmly. Li Wei smiled back, grateful for the simple kindness. He realized that human interactions could be positive and supportive if approached honestly. There was no need for lies, pretenses, or attempts to manipulate situations. Honesty and respect, he understood now, were far more powerful than any clever excuse. Li Wei bought a few postcards and a small figurine as a reminder of the day. He carefully placed them in his bag, feeling a sense of accomplishment, not because he had avoided trouble, but because he had learned something meaningful. Each item he purchased was now more than a souvenir. It was a symbol of his humility, reflection, and personal growth. As he walked back toward the main exit, he saw the guard who had stopped him earlier. This time Li Wei approached slowly, respectfully nodding in acknowledgement. The guard returned a neutral look, and Li Wei realized that no words were needed. Respect had been communicated silently. He felt a quiet pride in himself, not for breaking rules or bluffing, but for recognizing his mistakes and choosing to act with honesty going forward. On the path back to the bus, Li Wei encountered several fellow tourists. They chatted briefly about the site, sharing favorite parts and observations. Li Wei joined the conversation, careful to listen and contribute without dominating. He found that people responded positively to his genuine interest and attentiveness. The earlier embarrassment faded slightly, replaced by a growing sense of understanding. He realized that experiences, even uncomfortable ones, could teach more than smooth, flawless adventures ever could. Li Wei reflected on the morning's events again, thinking about how different his day could have been. Ignoring the rules had brought anxiety and embarrassment. Pretending to be someone else had made things worse, but by facing the situation honestly, showing respect and observing carefully, he had turned the day around. He felt a deep appreciation for the lessons learned, understanding that mistakes did not have to define the experience. They could shape it positively if approached with humility. As the bus approached to take him to his next destination, Li Wei looked out the window at the site one last time. The walls, gardens, and structures seemed to hold a quiet wisdom, as if the history itself was teaching him patience, respect, and attentiveness. He smiled, realizing that travel was more than seeing landmarks. It was about learning, growing, and understanding both the world and oneself. Before boarding, Li Wei took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Next time I will listen. Next time I will respect. Next time I will remember today." He climbed onto the bus, feeling lighter, wiser, and more aware than he had at the start of the morning. The incident with the guard, the failed attempt to pretend to be Japanese, and the embarrassment had all contributed to a lesson he would never forget. As the bus drove away, Li Wei made a mental note to always check signs carefully, to follow instructions, and to interact honestly with local authorities. He understood that cultural respect was not an obstacle but a guide, helping visitors like him navigate unfamiliar places safely and meaningfully. He realized that the thrill of adventure was not in breaking rules but in observing, learning, and appreciating the world around him. Li Wei's journey continued, each step now guided by awareness and humility. The morning incident had transformed him, turning a moment of recklessness into an unforgettable lesson. He was no longer the careless tourist who ignored the guard. He was a traveler who had learned that respect, honesty, and attentiveness were essential parts of any adventure, and that sometimes the greatest lessons came from the moments we least expect. By the time he arrived at the next site, Li Wei felt ready. He was cautious but eager, respectful but curious. The morning's embarrassment had faded into memory, replaced by understanding, awareness, and a newfound appreciation for the rules, the guards, and the people who maintained the beauty of the place he had come to explore. He knew that this day would stay with him forever, shaping the way he traveled, the way he interacted with the world, and the way he approached every adventure in the future. Li Wei stepped off the bus at his next stop, a quieter section of the historical site, one that promised both beauty and a lesson in patience. He felt the lingering tension from the morning, the memory of the guard, and the embarrassment that had followed him through the day. Yet unlike before, there was no panic, only awareness. He walked slowly, taking in every detail, aware of his surroundings, and conscious of the boundaries set before him. As he approached a narrow path lined with ancient trees, Li Wei noticed a small group of tourists gathered near a restricted section. There, a young boy carefully followed the signs, his parents gently reminding him to stay within the allowed areas. Li Wei watched them for a moment, noting the contrast with his own earlier behavior. He had rushed, ignored warnings, and believed he could charm his way past authority. The boy, however, moved with respect and attentiveness, learning without needing a mistake to teach him. Li Wei felt a twinge of humility, understanding that lessons were sometimes better seen than told. The path led to a stone bridge over a shallow, sparkling stream. The water flowed gently, reflecting the sunlight and the green canopy above. Li Wei paused, feeling a calm wash over him. The serenity of the scene seemed to demand quiet respect. He remembered the earlier chaos of his confrontation with the guard and smiled faintly at how far he had come. The anxiety of the morning had been replaced with careful observation. He had learned to notice small details, the rope barriers, the signs, the watchful eyes of the guards, and the unspoken rules that made the site both safe and meaningful. A guide approached, speaking in the local language and gesturing to different architectural features. Li Wei listened attentively, nodding and taking mental notes. He realized that he had almost missed the richness of the site because of his earlier focus on avoiding rules and pretending to be someone else. The guide pointed to a carving on a wall explaining its history and significance. Li Wei leaned in closer, fascinated. For the first time that day, he felt fully present, appreciating the site not just as a tourist, but as a learner. As he continued along the path, Li Wei noticed a small garden section cordoned off with ropes and clear signage. A guard stood nearby, silently observing. Li Wei approached slowly, mindful of the distance and his posture. He remembered how the morning had unfolded, how his arrogance and carelessness had led to embarrassment, and he resolved not to repeat the mistake. He paused briefly, reading the sign carefully. It warned visitors not to enter, to preserve delicate plants, and to respect the area's historical integrity. Li Wei nodded, mentally marking the lesson. Boundaries were not suggestions, but part of the preservation of something greater than himself. A few tourists lingered near the same area, discussing the plants and the careful work that had gone into maintaining them. Li Wei joined the conversation, asking polite questions and listening to the guide's answers. He felt a subtle pride in engaging respectfully. Unlike earlier, he did not try to rush past rules or pretend to be someone else. Instead, he approached each interaction with curiosity and humility. This shift in perspective made him realize that true travel was about understanding, not just seeing, and about listening, not just moving. As Li Wei walked further, he came across a small courtyard with statues and inscriptions. The area was quiet, the air filled with a sense of history. He read each plaque, absorbing information and taking mental notes. He noticed a guard in the corner, observing visitors attentively. Unlike before, Li Wei did not ignore him. He made a conscious effort to maintain respectful distance, showing awareness and consideration. The guard nodded briefly, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and Li Wei felt a warm sense of validation. Respect, he realized, often spoke louder than words. While exploring the courtyard, Li Wei noticed a group of tourists who were struggling with a language barrier. They were unsure about certain rules, hesitating near a restricted area. Li Wei approached them cautiously, offering to translate what he could. Using the few phrases he had learned, he helped them understand the signage and the guard's instructions. The tourists smiled gratefully, and Li Wei felt a sense of accomplishment. Helping others navigate the rules reminded him of the importance of patience, understanding, and clear communication, a stark contrast to the recklessness of his morning. Li Wei continued on, reaching a set of stairs leading to an elevated platform overlooking the site. The view was breathtaking. From above, he could see the intricate layout of the gardens, the pathways winding through historical structures, and the distant mountains in the background. He took out his camera again, but this time not to rush through, but to capture the beauty with care. Each photo was composed thoughtfully, reflecting his new approach, mindful, patient, and respectful. As he descended the stairs, Li Wei noticed a small group of local students on a field trip. They were learning about the site, asking questions, and listening carefully to their teacher. The children moved respectfully, understanding the importance of boundaries and instructions. Li Wei watched them and felt inspired. He remembered how his own behavior had been the opposite that morning. The contrast was clear, and it reinforced the lessons he had been learning. Humility, patience, and attentiveness were far more valuable than pride or shortcuts. A few minutes later, Li Wei encountered another checkpoint, similar to the one he had ignored earlier. This time he approached deliberately, showing his ticket and identification immediately. The guard smiled slightly, acknowledging his cooperation. Li Wei felt a deep sense of relief and pride. He realized that following rules, while sometimes inconvenient, was simpler and far less stressful than trying to avoid consequences through deception. The ease and clarity of his actions now contrasted sharply with the chaos of the morning. He continued through the site, moving with a calm and reflective pace. Every interaction, every glance at the signs, and every observation of the guards reminded him of the importance of awareness and respect. Li Wei began to notice subtler details, the sound of water trickling in fountains, the careful arrangement of stones in gardens, the delicate carvings on statues that had survived centuries. His mind was no longer racing with panic or schemes. It was focused, present, and appreciative. At a small cafe near the exit, Li Wei stopped to rest. He ordered a local snack and sat at a table overlooking a peaceful garden. As he ate, he reflected on the lessons of the day. The morning's mistake had been painful, embarrassing, and unforgettable, but it had also transformed him. He had learned that ignoring rules, pretending to be someone else, or relying on arrogance was never a path to success or safety. Instead, humility, attentiveness, and honesty had guided him back to a more meaningful experience. While sipping water, he noticed a family struggling to understand a rule about the cafe's seating arrangement. Li Wei approached and kindly explained, using simple gestures and broken phrases. The family smiled and thanked him. For the first time that day, he felt that his presence could be positive and helpful, rather than disruptive. He realized that respect was contagious. When he acted with humility and consideration, others responded in kind. As the afternoon wore on, Li Wei continued exploring the remaining sections of the site. Each corner, each garden, each historical artifact was now approached with care and attention. He took notes, photos, and mental snapshots, fully aware that he was learning as much as he was seeing. The embarrassment of the morning lingered but no longer dominated his thoughts. It had become a lesson, a turning point, and a guide for the rest of his journey. By the time he reached the exit, Li Wei felt transformed. The incident with the guard, the failed attempt to pretend to be Japanese, and the subsequent embarrassment had all taught him valuable lessons about travel, respect, and self-awareness. He understood that rules were not obstacles to fun, but guides to meaningful experiences. He realized that cultural awareness and humility could make any trip richer, safer, and more enjoyable. As he walked back to the bus station, Li Wei reflected on the day with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had faced consequences, learned from mistakes, and grown in ways he had not expected. The historical site had offered not just beauty and history, but also a personal lesson in respect, patience, and integrity. Li Wei smiled to himself, knowing that the embarrassment and anxiety he had felt earlier were now part of a story he would carry for the rest of his travels. Before boarding the bus, he paused one last time to look back at the site. The walls, gardens, and statues seemed to hold silent wisdom, as if acknowledging his growth. Li Wei took a deep breath and whispered, "I will never forget this lesson." With a final nod, he walked onto the bus, feeling lighter, wiser, and more aware than when he had first arrived. The morning's mistake had become a turning point, transforming him from a reckless, overconfident tourist into a thoughtful, respectful traveler. Li Wei stepped off the bus one last time, his heart calmer than it had been all day. The morning's chaos, the misunderstanding with the guard, the failed attempt to pretend to be Japanese, and the embarrassment that had followed him, felt like a distant memory now, yet its lessons lingered clearly in his mind. As he walked toward a quieter part of the site, he felt more alert, more respectful, and more aware of his surroundings than ever before. Each step reminded him that travel was not just about moving from one place to another. It was about learning, observing, and growing. He paused at a small courtyard, shaded by trees with leaves rustling gently in the afternoon breeze. Li Wei watched as other tourists moved carefully along the pathways, reading the signs, taking photos, and listening to guides. Unlike earlier, he no longer felt the urge to rush or to stand out. Instead, he followed the path slowly, noticing the details that had eluded him before. The patterns in the stonework, the careful preservation of the plants, and the calm authority of the guards now filled him with admiration rather than fear. Li Wei approached another restricted section, marked clearly with ropes and signs. He stopped, reading every word carefully. Unlike the reckless disregard of the morning, he now understood that these barriers were not meant to annoy him. They were there to protect history, culture, and the effort of countless people who had preserved this place. He adjusted his pace, walking respectfully alongside the barrier, making sure to give space to both the guards and other visitors. A group of local students passed by, their teacher explaining the importance of following rules and respecting the site. Li Wei watched them closely, impressed by their attentiveness and curiosity. He realized that travel was not simply about seeing famous landmarks, but about understanding the people, the culture, and the effort behind them. The children's respect reminded him of the humility he had learned, and he felt grateful for the chance to witness such mindfulness. Li Wei reached a small garden filled with flowers he had never seen before. The colors were vibrant, the fragrances subtle and calming. He knelt briefly to examine a particularly beautiful bloom, careful not to touch it too much. As he admired the delicate petals, he thought about the morning's mistakes. Pretending to be someone else, ignoring rules, and acting carelessly had almost ruined his experience. Now he understood that patience, observation, and honesty could make every moment richer. While in the garden, Li Wei noticed a tourist struggling to understand a sign. Using his basic language skills, he offered help, explaining the instructions gently and pointing to the relevant details. The tourist smiled, grateful for the assistance. Li Wei felt a warm sense of accomplishment. Helping others navigate the site respectfully reinforced his own growth. He realized that humility and attentiveness could create positive experiences, not just for himself, but for others as well. Continuing along the path, Li Wei encountered a small fountain. The water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting the surrounding trees and buildings. He paused to take a photo, but this time he did so slowly and thoughtfully, capturing the moment rather than rushing through it. The patience he exercised made the photograph more meaningful, a memory of both the beauty of the place and the lessons he had learned that day. Li Wei noticed the guard who had stopped him earlier, standing at a distance and observing the visitors. He approached carefully, bowing slightly in respect, and offered a polite nod. The guard returned the gesture, neutral but acknowledging. In that simple interaction, Li Wei felt a sense of closure. The tension that had dominated the morning was gone, replaced by understanding and mutual respect. He realized that respect did not require words. It could be communicated through actions and awareness. As he walked further, he encountered another group of tourists who seemed unsure about a restricted area. Li Wei offered guidance, explaining what the signs meant and how to behave appropriately. The tourists followed his advice, and he noticed their smiles as they continued exploring safely. Li Wei felt a sense of pride, not in cleverness or bravado, but in helping others navigate the site responsibly. He understood now that travel was not a competition to outsmart rules, but a chance to engage meaningfully with the environment and people around him. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pathways. Li Wei found a quiet bench and sat down, taking in the scene. The site was peaceful, full of life and history, and he felt a sense of connection to it all. He thought back to the morning, remembering how his reckless behavior had drawn attention and caused unnecessary stress. The embarrassment, though unpleasant at the time, had been an important lesson. It had taught him humility, patience, and the value of respecting boundaries. Li Wei pulled out his notebook and began to write, capturing his reflections from the day. He wrote about the mistake with the guard, the failed attempt to pretend to be Japanese, and the embarrassment that had followed. He also wrote about the lessons he had learned, the importance of following rules, observing carefully, helping others, and approaching every situation with honesty and respect. Writing helped him process the experience fully, turning what had been a moment of discomfort into a lasting memory and guide for the future. While writing, Li Wei noticed a couple nearby struggling with a map. He approached and offered assistance, pointing out the paths and explaining the layout in simple words. The couple thanked him warmly, and Li Wei felt a sense of fulfillment. He realized that respect and attentiveness could create positive experiences, not just for himself but for everyone around him. The morning's mistakes had been painful, but they had also opened the door to this new awareness. As he closed his notebook and stood up, Li Wei looked around at the site one last time. The walls, gardens, fountains, and statues all seemed to reflect a quiet dignity. He understood that this place had survived centuries because people respected it, preserved it, and followed its rules. His earlier arrogance, pretending to be someone else and ignoring authority, had almost led him to clash with that dignity. Now he felt a deep appreciation for the lessons learned and the chance to experience the site properly. Li Wei walked toward the exit slowly, savoring the last moments of his visit. He passed the guards, giving a polite nod, and they returned neutral gestures. The interaction was simple but meaningful, a silent acknowledgement of respect and understanding. Li Wei realized that every small act of attentiveness, every choice to follow rules, and every moment of humility had added up to a richer, more meaningful experience than he could have imagined at the start of the day. Outside the site, he took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face. The embarrassment from the morning was now fully transformed into a memory of growth. Li Wei knew that he would carry this experience with him on every future trip, reminding himself to be patient, respectful, and honest. The incident with the guard had been a turning point, a moment that reshaped how he approached the world and interacted with others. Li Wei paused at a small cafe nearby, ordering a drink to relax before heading back to his accommodation. As he sipped the cool beverage, he reflected once more on the day. The excitement, the mistakes, the embarrassment, the guidance from others, and the beauty of the site all blended into a single, unforgettable experience. He understood now that travel was not just about seeing landmarks. It was about learning, growing and becoming more aware of the world and himself. Before leaving, he looked around at the people enjoying the sight responsibly. Some were taking photos, others were reading signs carefully, and a few were quietly sitting and observing. Li Wei felt connected to them in a new way, sharing a mutual respect for the place. He realized that being a thoughtful traveler allowed him to fully appreciate the beauty and history around him, rather than just moving through it carelessly. As he walked back toward the bus stop to return to his hotel, Li Wei smiled to himself. The morning's mistakes had been hard to endure, but they had led to a transformation he would never forget. He felt wiser, more patient, and more aware of the importance of respect in every interaction. Pretending to be someone else, ignoring rules, and acting carelessly had been tempting, but honesty, humility, and attentiveness had proven far more rewarding. By the time Li Wei reached the bus, he was already thinking about his next destination. But now, he carried with him not just a map and a camera, but also the lessons of respect, patience, and cultural awareness. The embarrassment from the morning had been replaced with understanding and gratitude. He knew that he would never forget this day, that it had changed the way he would travel forever, and that the mistakes he had made had become the foundation for growth and learning. As the bus pulled away, Li Wei looked back at the site one last time. The walls, gardens, and statues seemed to shine in the fading light, reflecting centuries of care and preservation. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure and calm. The day had begun with mistakes, confusion, and embarrassment, but it ended with lessons learned, respect earned, and a new sense of understanding. Li Wei knew that this experience would stay with him, guiding his future adventures, shaping the way he approached challenges, and reminding him always to travel with honesty, humility, and attentiveness.